Welcome to the third and final plenary lecture in today's known plenary lecture series. It's quite exciting, so it's a great thrill to hear a new lecture from one of our wonderful colleagues. One of the reasons I thought of David for this talk, and had it many other people recommend that he speak with us this evening, is that I had heard him several years ago give a talk for the Phi Kappa Phi Honor Society initiation banquet on the poetics of place. It was quite a beautiful talk, and I thought he had an insight into the perhaps not strictly rational ways of knowing, and that's what we're going to be looking at in part this evening, I believe. David Moore is a professor of English at the University of Montana. His fields of research and teaching at graduate and undergraduate levels include cross-cultural American studies, Native American literatures, Western American literatures, peace studies, Baha'i studies, literature and the environment, and eco-critical and dialectical critical theory. He has taught previously at the University of South Dakota, Salish Kootenai College, University of Washington, and Cornell University. He was a recipient of a postdoctoral fellowship at the Society for the Humanities at Cornell University, and of the Faculty Research Fellowship in Western Studies at the O'Connor Center for the Rocky Mountain West, among other awards. His book, That Dream Shall Have a Name, Native Americans Rewriting America, is published by the University of Nebraska Press. His edited book, a collection of essays on prominent author Leslie Marmon Silko, is forthcoming from Bloomsbury Academic Publishers in the UK. Other publications include an edited volume of American Indian Quarterly, as well as numerous articles and chapters. He co-hosts Reflections West, a short weekly literary program on Montana Public Radio, and he has participated recently in theater productions by the Bearhead Swaney Intertribal Playwrights Project on the Flathead Reservation. Before we begin, I want to remind everybody to turn off your cell phones. Thank you, Dan. And I ask my students in Intro to Honors and pretty much every other class I ever teach to write discussion questions as they're reading, as they're listening to lectures. So I'd like to ask everyone to do that tonight, because we're going to have time for some discussion after the talk, and that goes better if you're keeping notes of your ideas and reflections as we go along. So use that left margin thoughtfully. What doesn't make sense? What connections occur to you? What background would you like to ask about? And then we'll have a lively discussion with Professor Moore after this. So welcome to Mr. David Moore.
Thank you so much, Professor Drake, and to the Honors College, and I'm delighted and grateful to be here. I like to follow in the honored U of M tradition of thanking the Indigenous peoples, especially the Salish, who camped on this very ground and lived here for millennia, for the welcome, indeed, to this learning environment. I'm curious if anybody knows what mountain that is. Any guesses? Anybody know?
I know where it is. I don't know exactly what it is. I'll go jump on the side of Flathead Lake.
Yeah, it's Chief Cliff, as they say. It's not Chief Mountain, which is up on the Rocky Mountain front by Browning. Chief Cliff in Kootenai country, at the north end of the Salish and Kootenai Reservation. That's Elmo Bay on the east side of Flathead Lake. And it's one of the, it's a photograph taken by a friend of mine who's Kootenai, and it's quite resonant of a kind of mountain that would speak to you, I guess, if you tried to listen. So indeed, this lecture is called Thinking with a Mountain, Indigenous Animism and Pluralism. And I think I have more time for animism tonight than pluralism. We'll make some gestures to that and perhaps get to it in the Q&A. But first, a caveat. I'm not Indigenous myself, and I would never pretend to give voice to Indigenous views. Instead, I am a listener and an ally, perhaps a translator. What I offer here are my own limited interpretations, and indeed, If cutting edge means I don't really know what I'm talking about, this is cutting edge research. These really are questions that I'm exploring right now and just beginning to find the remarkable resources on. And my own interpretations are touched by what some have called the Good Red Road, as well as by writings from the Baha'i Faith, by Aikido training. There's an incredible dojo here in town, and other personal experience. I am married into the Assiniboine tribe, and I participate in that ceremonial life, and I've been welcomed into families and ceremonial life among both Lakota and Kootenai communities. But none of that gives me what's called a cultural credit card. And as a listener, I've found that Indigenous folks have plenty to say to us Suyapis and Wazichus, and both in person and in print. So this is my attempt to do some of the listening. And you'll see that I draw on plenty of other non-Indigenous listeners and scholars and scientists as well. So and can you hear me okay in the back? So let's start with a generous prose passage by the remarkable Meskwaki writer, Ray Youngbear. Anybody familiar with his poetry and prose? Incredible writer. This is Youngbear from Iowa, Meskwaki tribe. My maternal grandmother used to say it was crucial we have a place of our own. Listening intently, I learned that our lives were dependent upon a plethora of animistic factors immersed in ethereal realities. Basically, she instructed that the very ground on which we all stood, Grandmother Earth, was the embodiment of a former supernatural being. She was all of nature, this grandmother. She was the foundation for rivers, lakes, fields, and forests. She provided homes and sustenance for insects, birds, reptiles, fish, animals, and human beings. She held everything together, including the clouds, stars, sun, and moon. Our sole obligation, my grandmother instructed, in having been created in the first place by the Holy Grandfather, is to maintain the principal religion of the Earth Lodge clans. That's from his book, Remnants of the First Earth, his second novel. And let's follow that right away with a passage cited by eminent Dakota scholar Vine Deloria Jr. He explains that John Swanton, the great anthropologist, writing about the Muskogee Creek Indians of the Southeast, summarized their beliefs regarding the nature of the world this way. The world and all that it contained were the products of mind and bore everywhere the marks of mind. Matter was not something which had given birth to mind, but something which had formerly been mind. Excuse me. Something from which mind had withdrawn, was quiescent, and out of which it might again be roused. I'm going to read that interrupted sentence again. Matter was not something which had given birth to mind, but something which had formerly been mind, something from which mind had withdrawn, was quiescent, and out of which it might again be roused. Continuing the quote. This mind was visibly manifested in the so-called living things as plants and still more animals. Nevertheless, latent within inorganic substance, no less than in plants and animals, was mind in its highest form, i.e. human mind. And this is an anthropologist's term. I'm not sure they would say human mind, but this might come to the surface at any time, but it did so particularly at the fasting warrior, the knower, and the doctor. Indeed, the importance of these two last lay in their ability to penetrate to the human life within the mineral, plant, and animal value in ordering the lives of their fellow beings. Not that mind was attributed to one individuality, but that it was recognized as everywhere of the same nature. That's cited again in Deloria. Thus, this evening, I have some heady questions for you toward earthy issues. And that's the end in the beginning, the meaning and the method, the point in the opening paragraph, that earth and thought, mind and matter may not be separate realms or realities of experience. Indeed, there are certain dualities, like body and spirit, night and day, but everything interpenetrates, as Yeats liked to say. Everything is dusk, breath, in and out, plus the pause between. There is the abstract, there is the concrete, but they are neither separate nor separable. In the dusk, morning or evening, is it night or day? It's always dusk somewhere, here, always in motion. And when we insist on dualities, on day versus night, or white versus black, we're locking down a changing reality. In either or, we're unreal. Further, the ancient term animism is useful shorthand for that observation of that linkage of body and spirit. Spirit is in bodies and bodies are in spirit. And looking ahead, the term pluralism is useful for the breakdown of social and species binaries that happens when we no longer insist on hierarchies. Pluralism becomes the political expression of animism. It's called spreading the wealth or spreading the love. Let's begin with a couple of exercises. First, think of your pet, or someone else's dog or cat that you adore or can't stand, whichever. Is that critter a thinking being? Is it animate or inanimate? Is it an inanimate dog? Clearly the categories don't apply. Then extend that sense of animism to your favorite rat, or gecko, or turtle. I once edited a book by a woman who wrote about her lifetime of pets and the real communications she had with a toucan bird, a turtle, her dogs, etc. It was compelling. Then extend that sense of consciousness in the animate sense of the animals you know, perhaps anywhere, to the trillions of bacteria that inhabit your body inside and out. And you may have heard of this new science of probiotics and biotics, that indeed those trillions of bacteria are driving many of your experiences and your personality and your life patterns. Is it impossible to conceive of various degrees of consciousness blurring all of these boundaries? Okay, that's clear that pets are animate. But here's a second experiment, and bear with me. Please close your eyes, or don't, as you wish, but think of the M above campus. Have you walked or run to the M? Now keep thinking of the M, keep that thought image in your mind, and here's a question. Where is that thought? Certainly it is in your mind, inside your body, but obviously it's not only in your mind because we're all here thinking of the M. Isn't it in my mind and your neighbor's mind and everyone else in this room? And isn't that thought somehow in the air between us and the M right there? However many hundreds or thousands of yards that may be. And doesn't that thought of the M reside and move among all the thousands of people who have walked to the M over the years? It's prodding them to exercise right now. Right now, that thought of the M is triggering guilt for not exercising. There are all kinds of thoughts that weave with that M, but where are those thoughts? And isn't that thought indeed out across the Missoula Valley, wherever people see the M in their peripheral vision? So where is that thought? Let's let that idea simmer, as it will, whether we let it or not, because it has a life of its own, growing and changing even now. You can keep your eyes closed the rest of the lecture, or you can, whatever you like. So onward. My title, Thinking with a Mountain, is of course a variation on Aldo Leopold's famous phrase from a Sand County Almanac, to think like a mountain. You may know that Leopold generated this concept in a now famous moment of profound regret for having shot a wolf. It's so sad. I can't even say it. For having shot a wolf and watching the fierce green fire dying in her eyes. That sense of alienation and the longing to recapture connection drives Leopold's even more famous land ethic, and indeed his attempt to think like a mountain instead. I could quote you that land ethic if you want, and we'll do that later. I choose a different preposition from like, because like maintains a certain distance, born not only of regret over brutal exploitation, but born also of the Western culture of rationalism, scientism, and the cult of objectivity, where this over here is like that over there, like tends to maintain the self-other dualism that misses the one mind of animism. By contrast, with engages the mountain as an equal in the process of thinking and appeals away the hypothetical, the analytical distance of Leopold's sympathetic but nostalgic usage to think like a mountain. I don't need to overwork this distinction, but I think it points to a significant difference in approach and effect. And let me suggest, what does Mount Sentinel think about the M? We'll let that continue. What does Mount Sentinel think about our label Mount Sentinel? Following on Leopold's thinking in the next generation, and in contrast to Leopold's ironically distancing nostalgia, David Abram has a project to understand and experience communication and even identification with what he calls the more than human world, through a probing philosophical study of perception and language among animist cultures. He has worked closely with indigenous cultures from Bali to North America to Tibet, as well as with linguistic anthropologists and French phenomenologists to map what he calls reciprocal participatory perception as a kind of techne or technology of animism. Reciprocal participatory perception. It's both are feeling it and aware of it in varying degrees. Contrasting language use among written and oral cultures, Abram uses different forms of language to get at an animate sensitivity, showing how the physical senses tune into consciousness across the self-other divide. He explains ways of seeing and knowing that clearly register expressive selfhood in trees and animals and other creatures. I'm curious if in Ways of Knowing or other places anybody's read David Abram, The Spell of the Sensuous. Just curious. It's really quite remarkable, as is his other book, Becoming Animal. In The Spell of the Sensuous, Abram explains that, quote, The experiencing body is not a self-enclosed object, but an open, incomplete entity. And in many ways, we become who we are by being open to our environment, obviously, which interacts with the environment and other bodies to complete its moment-by-moment learning of itself and the world. Abram elaborates in his book, Becoming Animal, on the notion of mind as inhabiting more than your brain pan. Grounding language in our experiment was to start with the sense of mind beyond our skull. Grounding language and perception in bodies as windows to mental activity, Abram makes it clear how thought is a field that we enter. One of my favorite poets, Robert Duncan, refers to poetry as opening the field, going into a sort of Jungian realm of collective unconscious. Indeed, we in this room are building a pattern of thought together as Abram sees, let me do that sentence again, grounding language and perception in bodies as windows to mental activity. He makes it clear how thought is a field that we enter. And as I hope I warned you, this is heady thinking about very earthy matters. And it really does take a lot of brain calories. I hope you can stay focused at this late hour. Abram even suggests in Becoming Animal and Earthly Cosmology that the Descartesian European notion of the interior mind and of romantic individuality is a reactionary defense in the modern age against both the Copernican discovery of cosmic infinitude and the Columbian discovery of colonial otherness. And that's for another discussion, but let me just say that this kind of retreat inside is a reaction against Copernicus throwing away that ancient Christian, terracentric worldview, and a reaction against Columbus opening up a whole world of otherness to Europe. More positively, Abram defines mind as intricately woven in matter. Here's a quote, and I'm going to bring these longer quotes up for you to read with me. There was some that I forgot to bring up for you. Let's see how this is going to work. Yeah. When we allow that mind is a luminous quality of the earth, we swiftly notice this consequence. Each region, each topography, each uniquely patterned ecosystem has its own particular awareness, its unique style of intelligence. Certainly the atmosphere, the translucent medium of exchange between the breathing bodies of any locale, is subtly different in each terrain. The air of the coastal northwest of North America, infused with salt spray and the tang of spruce, cedar, and fir needles, tastes and feels different from the air shimmering in the heat of the Southwest desert. In his project to ground the abstract in the concrete and vice versa, Abram continues with detailed descriptions of squawks and guttural cries of black-gleamed ravens and how they speak different dialects in the Northwest and the Southwest. Invoking the different rhythms of change and metamorphosis in each place, Abram identifies the sentience of that land, the state of mind of a place. With such grounding, he affirms that thought itself is both material and non-material, and he does so in a question right there. What if thought is not born within the human skull, but is a creativity proper to the body as a whole, arising spontaneously from the slippage between an organism and its folding terrain that it wanders? What if the curious curve of thought is engendered by the difficult eros and tension between our flesh and the flesh of the earth? The mind, the life of thought, the abstractions of consciousness become communications between and among bodies. There's a lot to Abram, and I can certainly send you guys this set of readings. This is one I'm not going to take time for that goes into the details of that phenomenology via Merleau-Ponty. But I'm going to move on from David Abram to Eduardo Kahn in this remarkable book, How Forests Think. Eduardo Kahn, studying the Runa people and their environment in the upper reaches of the Amazon in the Ecuadorian forest, carries this conversation about consciousness in nature further in his book, How Forests Think, Toward a More Than Human Anthropology. And here's his first quotation. Life is constitutively semiotic, and we'll go back to that term in a minute. That is, life is through and through the product of sign processes. This is incredibly exciting idea. And it's really subtle and difficult, and we'll spend a little time with it. What differentiates life from the inanimate physical world is that life forms represent the world in some way or another, and these representations are intrinsic to their being. And I'll go to his own explanation at the top of the page there. Semiosis, the creation and interpretation of signs, permeates and constitutes the living world. And it is, I think there's a word missing there, through our partially shared semiotic propensities that multi-species relations are possible and also analytically comprehensible. Something's off the page there. Basically, what Kahn is saying is that living things learn how to survive, how to live, by reading their environment, by reading the signs. And that's a semiotic process. This is a constant and infinite process. A bear sees a river and reads it as a sign of fish. A squirrel reads a telephone wire as a bridge to that oak tree. A mosquito reads the carbon dioxide in your breath as a promise of blood. Every moment of evolution is infinitely a consciousness reading signs to survive and evolve. It's so fundamental that it's hard to see. Semiotics is the study of this semiosis. And frankly, I'll share with you, when I first encountered semiotics in the 1970s, I despised it. It was very dry theory. But gradually I've seen its accuracy and even wisdom. And Eduardo Kahn, takes it further still. Western critical theory in the 20th century, especially structuralism and post-structuralism, has been focused via the linguist Ferdinand de Saussure on semiosis as a symbolic process, a particular kind of semiosis, where each sign is a part of a social system, a human convention called language. And if you haven't studied Saussure, we can spend the rest of the Q&A to midnight talking about it. But Kahn points out by way of Charles Sanders Peirce, who was a contemporary of Saussure, and Saussure died in 1913, Peirce died in 1914, that there are different kinds or degrees of semiosis in addition to the symbolic. Peirce calls these different modes of representations iconic, involving signs that share likenesses with the things they represent, or indexical, involving signs that are in some way affected by or otherwise directly correlated with the things they represent. So Abram has given us a kind of technology, which we don't have full time to go into in detail tonight, of the language of animism. And Eduardo Kahn, in this further exploration of the details of semiosis is giving us more technical understanding of the perceptions of animism. And let me read that again. There are different modes of representation where critters are always reading signs by these modes of representation. There's the symbolic, which is human language, built on systems or conventions of signs that we call language. This word is part of a whole system. There's symbolic representation. There's iconic representation, and there's indexical kinds of representation. I don't think we need to dwell on the detailed definitions of those, but where he goes with that is that, well, I'll give you more details, but in the forest, parts of the forest are operating by iconic and indexical semiosis as ways of living. Kahn explains, speaking of the Ecuadorian jungle, how to a monkey, the sound of a palm tree crashing down in the forests represents danger, iconically, by bearing a likeness to heaviness and violence to the tree itself on the way down. So the monkey hears the sound, and that's a representation, oh, there's a tree falling, iconically. Plus, the tree itself represents danger indexically by pointing out, get out of the way as it falls. And the monkey gets that message and jumps. That's semiosis, to survive. The monkey, that's indexical semiosis. The monkey reads those signs in order to survive. It doesn't need human language to get the message. In other words, there's this consciousness that's animate and communicating. Here's more, maybe you've read this already, and this is a kind of nice summary. We conflate representation, this is Kahn and How Forests Think, with language in the sense that we tend to think of how representation works in terms of our assumptions about how human language works. Because linguistic representation is based on signs that are conventional, systemically related to one another, and arbitrarily related to their objects of reference, which is something the post-structuralists love to play with, the arbitrariness of the sign. We tend to assume that all representational processes have these properties. But symbols, those kinds of signs that are based on convention, like the English word dog, which are distinctively human representational forms and whose properties make human language possible, actually emerge from and relate to other modalities of representation. In Peirce's terminology, these other modalities in broad terms are either iconic, involving signs that share likenesses with the things they represent, or indexical, involving signs that are in some way affected or otherwise correlated with things they represent. And he uses for indexical the hunters in the forest pulling on vines to get the monkeys to move out of the top branches so they can shoot them. And the monkey reads the pulling of that vine as an index of some change coming, and an alert, a need to be alert. I'm glad we're going to have a Q&A, because I can see furrowed brows. Kahn extends these modalities of representation in semiosis to the ability of an organism to learn by representation. And then he defines such learning processes as synonymous with life itself. Such life is an animate universe that is always learning as each event experience represents a next possibility for order, for life to continue. As Kahn explains, number 3 there, all signs, and not just those we might call magical, traffic in the future in the way that this word tie, that from the Runa language does, and that means a sound that before pulling the trigger, a hunter makes the sound of a gunshot hitting its mark. They are calls to act in the present through an absent but represented, that's misspelled, represented future that by virtue of this call then comes to affect the present. So each sign has a forward momentum into the future. Thus, life reads present signs for survival in the future. Both humans and non-humans, if we still want to maintain those categories, read the world and thus think about it. As Kahn explains of the Ecuadorian people who think with their forest, Runa animism grows out of a need to interact with semiotic selves. Here, I think that one's here too. Yeah. Runa animism grows out of a need to interact with semiotic selves as selves, qua selves, in all their diversity. Sorry, that is partly off the sign. It is grounded, is what it should say. It is grounded in an ontological fact. There exist other kinds of thinking selves beyond the human. Now, there's a whole other chapter of this discussion, and I'm coming to the last page here, because I'm leaving that other chapter out, and that's quantum physics and its hard problem of consciousness, as David Chalmers and others are calling it, where the measurement problem brings physics to the sense of consciousness in matter. But we'll have to save that for another day. I'll finish with Vine Deloria, whom we started with. Vine Deloria Jr., the leading American Indian intellectual of the late 20th century, after writing God is Red, A Native View of Religion, and The Metaphysics of Modern Existence, among many other books, finished his publishing career with the book called The World We Used to Live In, Remembering the Powers of the Medicine Men. His works go a long way toward explaining these issues from indigenous perspectives, but he also draws on modern physics and Western science. And he'll take us towards the end here. There seems to be a reasonable number of Western scientists and thinkers who subscribe to the idea that the ultimate constituent of the universe is mind or mind stuff. Fred Alan Wolf, a physicist writing popular interpretive books on the new understanding of the universe, has written, "Today our position is close to the one discovered by basic tribal peoples. The concept of universal energy in our language, our scientific language, might be called the universal quantum wave function, or matter wave or probability wave of quantum physics. This wave pervades everything, and like the universal energy, it resists objective discovery. It appears as a guiding influence in all that we observe. Perhaps it is the same thing as the clear light, the all-pervading consciousness without an object of Buddhist thought." Consciousness without an object. And then that's the item that we started with there. So this notion of a Buddhist view of pervading consciousness without an object takes us to a whole other realm of indigenous perspective in another part of the world that seems to be here in mind as well. And I'll end on that opening to another realm of Buddhist thought. Questions? Yes.
Sharon? Oh, sorry.
I'm just trying to read this because otherwise it's way too long. The mention of the use of the word like when you were discussing the difference between thinking like a mountain and thinking with a mountain got me thinking about other possible linguistic limitations in our scientific community. For example, a few days ago, the BBC released a radio documentary that it did with several prominent researchers into plant biology and neurological workings within plants.
You might want to be a little louder. Can you hear him in the back?
But they, researchers over the last couple decades have found increasingly that plants, unlike animals, have neurological functions, or the cells that operate like nerves in effectively every tissue instead of just isolated specific tissues like an animal. But many members of the scientific community have been reluctant to accept the reality that that is a form of intelligence.
Or communication.
Yeah, or communication, saying that you need a central neural hub and like an isolated neurological system.
That's begging the question.
To constitute a mind, and I was just wondering if you thought that was like further indicative of our limitations linguistically thinking about it.
That's a great example, and indeed, I thought about bringing plant intelligence into this. There was a remarkable New Yorker article about it a year ago. I think it's called Plant Intelligence. There's so much research being done on a central tree that indeed does have a kind of commanding role in a network of roots in a forest system. But that's a perfect example of begging the question as a logical. The question is mind and consciousness a central individual experience, or is it a field? And what that argument is saying is it can't be a field because it's a central individual experience. It's begging the question. And if there is indeed evidence of a field of mind in a botanical community, it's very interesting that a scientific prejudice literally is ignoring those facts. What prejudice does, other than separate from opinion and belief, is it operates in spite of the facts. And that's what begging the question does. There was a question, yeah.
So given the way that in society we have arranged it so that we kind of domineer over nature, would you say that the innovation of a symbolic language allowed us to domineer over and to separate ourselves from the nature that we were traditionally so entwined with and so one mind with?
That's exactly David Abrams' argument in Spell of the Sensuous, where he analyzes literate and written language in comparison with oral use of language, and where the sign of the language takes place on a page rather than between you and me in the oral experience, that alphabetic language, as he calls it, putting it into written form on a page or a tablet or whatever, clay tablet or, iPad, creates a layer between the observer and the observed, and indeed creates a separate reality of language as written. And that is indeed, in his estimation, a barrier between Western alphabetic languages, and it's different in Chinese ideograms, but the Arabic languages might be more similar to the Indo-European, and whether or not that is causative for the alienation from nature in Western culture that leads to the Industrial Revolution, or if there are other economic factors, which I would suggest there are, it certainly has an important logic. I think you're onto something there. Did that get at your question?
Yes.
They're back here?
Yeah. Do you think it's really
I can't hear you.
Oh, okay. Do you think it's the linguistic limitations of people
that causes this duality, so to speak, or just their arrogance?
That's almost a nature and nurture question. You know, is it human nature to be dominating, or is it our culture and our economy that make us that way? Two books I'd recommend. One is indeed Spell of the Sensuous by David Abram, that tries to get at that. It is actually a kind of ethnography of indigenous cultures in contrast to Western cultures. And there are examples of domination at varying degrees in each of those. The other book I'd recommend is a classic by Erich Fromm called Anatomy of Human Destructiveness. That's a social psychological study basically of capitalism. And he looks also ethnographically at many cultures around the world, indigenous cultures largely, where there simply isn't the kind of domination that modern societies impose on each other. And he attributes that largely to the economy, to the economic system of capital. He's not a Marxist, but it's an interesting psychological angle on that. And by saying I think it's a nature-nurture question, I think it's all of the above. That people, there is testosterone and arrogance, and there is also linguistic alienation, which makes that arrogance and that aggression acceptable because you're alienated from your enemy. But there's a great catalog of examples of demagogues who raise up their people through language to become monsters. The classic in the late 20th century was the Rwandan genocide, where on the radio the demagogues were labeling their enemy as cockroaches. Go out and cut those cockroaches to death. And people went and followed that. Pure linguistic control of aggression. And there are lots of other examples of demonizing the other, basically. Does that get at your question?
Yeah, I was also kind of wondering if just the unwillingness to accept the idea that we're not possibly the best at whatever, if we're not the center of the universe, if that's more related to arrogance than anything else.
How about probing arrogance to fear? So often anger is based in repressed fear. And indeed, fear of loss of power would make sense. But I would definitely describe that as cultural rather than human nature. There are many cultures that don't see humans as the best. Deloria often describes indigenous cultures that see themselves, as the Kootenai, they were the last to be created, and all the other critters have powers that the humans have to call on for help. And so you have to be in tune with them in order to survive. Other questions, anybody? So as I mentioned at the beginning, I was raising questions. And for me, this notion that there's an animate universe really is very different from Western thinking, in which many of us are raised. and just to get a glimpse of the technology of animism, or the ways that we can look at the world and experience the world differently, I think is starting to ask the right questions, or important ones anyway. Any further questions? Where are we with time? Yes?
How do you feel that Deloria or Abram kind of differ from, say, philosophers in like the Frankfurt School, like you were talking about, like their Marxist semiotics, and because in certain ways I feel like someone like Adorno is using this really rash, sort of very critical, analytical Marxist lens to analyze semiotics of modern culture, and in what ways do you feel that kind of like this sort of analytical, empirical view of, or trying to figure out semiotic structures, does that sort of coerce like a truth experience, or like any, you know what I mean?
Is it too heady?
Is it like and I'm just curious how someone like Abram and Deloria, coming from a more, I think, organic or holistic point of view, how they view their own sort of sociological and analytical process?
That's a really subtle question. I appreciate it. I'm not sure I'm grasping it fully, but let me say a couple things for starters, and maybe you can help me understand the question better. Abram loves to write sensual language. As in the couple of things I read, where he's describing the air of the Northwest compared to the Southwest, he gets into this phenomenology in Merleau-Ponty and very philosophical and rational analysis, but he always pumps imagery into his prose. And I don't think Adorno does that. Another chapter of this that I didn't mention is the whole feminist new materialism. Jane Bennett in Vibrant Matter is up there on the screen, and she makes a very clear distinction. She says she's she looks at how matter has agency in itself, vibrant matter, and it's different from old vitalism in a very subtle analysis in her book. And she makes a distinction between herself and Adorno. She's more on the Spinoza side of materialism than the Adorno side of materialism. And I think that has an ecstatic level even to it, or certainly an experiential level that it doesn't have the distance of rationality. But it's all, I think Adorno, I think they're all striving to overcome that alienation, obviously. There's more to your question, though. Does that get at it? It's really fascinating. Please.
You got me thinking a little about, well, trees and mountains, I know, but also, I guess there's animism in the West, and I'm reminded of some interesting passages in the ancients, certainly, where
Yes.
well, there's animism in Aristotle's philosophy, but going back to Socrates, some wonderful passages where he talks about how the trees used to talk and people used to believe this, and we think we're so above that now, but maybe there's something to it, and he discusses the inferiority of the written word. I think is it the Phaedrus or something? One of those dialogues has some content there. I just wondered if you'd comment on maybe do we fall into a false dichotomy where we see this as two irreconcilable approaches, and maybe that relates to your question as well, that there's some interesting points of convergence, at least if you go back for enough.
Well, and the whole Romantic movement at the late 18th century and early 19th century is indeed an effort to get back to nature, and animism is a clear part of that. And the flip side of that I want to say is it's really possible to romanticize this pursuit as well. And that's its own set of problems. But I'm grateful for the reminder. Leslie Silko, in her last novel, Gardens in the Dunes, she's a Laguna Pueblo, very prominent Native American novelist. She makes a point of the ancient European pre-Athens cultures and pre-Christian cultures being very tied in with this indigenous animist worldview. And indeed, I think in every age there are poets and philosophers who move in that direction. From, every culture in the globe, basically. And then there are also staunch rationalists who would call it all superstition. Thank you for the reminder.
I'm curious if the eternal form of M is floating between us.
Say what?
The eternal form of M is still floating between us.
Oh. Yeah. There's a lot of M's in animism. Other questions? Please.
Well, earlier there was some discussion, I believe earlier, of whether or not it was the cause or the effect of a less animistic thinking in the West to have a more exploitative attitude towards nature. I was wondering also from a religious standpoint between the West and more native cultures here, if you believe that a less animistic viewpoint was the cause of why ancient religions were, for example, polytheistic rather than pantheistic in the West, where it's like having gods that specifically are denoted with an individual purpose and an individual domain, versus, for example, native belief, where there's not really an assigned deity or entity to any one force, rather they're part of a larger whole. Do you believe that was caused more out of an initial difference of thought, or that those differences in religious thought were what then expanded the difference in actual practice?
I've got to say, I think we're entering into a realm of impossible generalizations. I'm thinking there's a wonderful collection called the Eco-Criticism Reader that has an essay on the religious roots of our ecological crisis, basically, by Lynn White. And he attributes it all to the Judeo-Christian tradition, and that we need a religious change in order to solve the ecological problem. And then there's another essay, it's in another anthology, that points to the stewardship and ecological awareness in the Old Testament, and I think it's possible to find threads in almost any category, and indeed the boundaries blur. So that, and I wasn't able, I would love to talk with you more to get the details of what you were saying, but the categories are problematic. I think the details are real, but the categories are not. There are these forms of understanding that see animism in the universe and that see just animism in the universe. There are polytheistic animists, and there are polytheists that may not be ecologically ethical. I mean, the categories blur. And I think it really, I didn't start this lecture with Native American key principles, but tribal specificity and the differences between those groups is a key aspect of an accurate ethnology and anthropology. And the generalizations are useful, but they almost always break down. I'm not evading your question because I'd really like to pursue it, but I think we should take time to clarify the terms. Other comments? Yes.
So, previous to plenary lectures,
A little louder.
or previous to plenary lectures had addressed philosophy, religion, and science as three primary ways of knowing. Where do you see your topic, whole things being symbiotic, as falling in those three primary ways of knowing? Or do you see it as a fourth entirely separate one?
That's a question of categories again. I really do think I'm summoning all three here. And I gestured to other chapters that we're not getting, but there's the quantum physics is certainly science, and it's the philosophy, linguistic philosophy is semiosis, the philosophy of language, basically, and religion is a very general term that I think applies. I could be more specific. If is that useful? I find myself not being a post-structuralist, but being a skeptic about categories. I call it dialogics. Categories set up structures that are useful, and post-structuralism likes to deconstruct those structures. But even more than that, I think the reality of experience is beyond language and beyond the terms philosophy, religion, science. And indeed, we're trying to get at something always that's a little, well, Derrida calls it excess. Our very own Robert Baker in the English department calls it the extravagant. Poetry is always trying to get beyond language to something extravagant. And I think that's a kind of animist principle.
That's a beautiful point on which to end this lecture.
Thanks for staying over, you guys.
Thank you. Go forth and be extravagant.